Hello, this is Mark L. White for Health Hacks, and today I have my good friend Ryan Smith with us. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark. Appreciate it.
I've known you for a while. You've been in age management. I know that you used to run a company that did peptides, and recently you opened up a new company that's pretty exciting. It's epigenetic testing using DNA to tell us how old we really are.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. In the pharmacy world I was in previously, we were always looking at ways to vet the efficacy of therapy, particularly in things that would involve health span and lifespan. And that's when I became aware of this technology and created Tru Diagnostic to really help interpret that methylation and make it available to individuals to actually test how their own biological process of aging is going.
Well, why is it important? I mean, I've done a DNA test to tell me I'm 76% English and 21%, but it doesn't really have an actionable plan. Like, why is it important to know how old our DNA says we are?
Yeah, absolutely. The important thing to know is that age is the #1 risk factor for all chronic disease and death. If you wanted to do one thing to prevent Parkinson's or cancer or diabetes, that one thing would be to hopefully stop aging. And so, unfortunately, though, chronological age itself is not the best method for this. So, and that's due to phenotypic variation. We all know people in their 70s who look like they're in their 50s and vice versa. This is a more accurate way of telling how someone's body is aging rather than just chronological age. And the idea is that if we can measure this, then we can hopefully make changes or interventions to slow the aging process and therefore slow the risk and development of any of those chronic diseases and death. One statistic that I mentioned to you before, and I always like to mention, is that if everyone in the world were 7 years younger biologically than chronologically, we would all cut disease in half. 50% of disease would be reduced. And that's pretty incredible considering that aging itself has not necessarily been treated like with the health consequences it usually has.
Well, isn't it like when I think of DNA, isn't it kind of like the roll of the dice? We're born with the DNA we have.
Yeah, so the DNA absolutely has a big part to play, and that's one of the frustrating things about traditional DNA testing is that although it might inform you about how you should live your life to improve health consequences, it's really not changeable, at least at this moment. Epigenetics is a little bit different because we're not necessarily measuring the sequence. What we're measuring is what genes are turned on or turned off, and we actually do have some control over that. So what we can actually do with these measurements is look at them and then implement some type of change in our lifestyle, diet, nutrition, medications in order to then change these patterns.
So, like, the way I understand it then is we're born with our DNA. You look at those DNA, and then based on how well we've taken care of our body, shows how that DNA has held up with the aging process, i.e., how much mutation it's had.
So what we're sort of looking at in particular, what we're measuring is methylation. So methylation is generally sort of a carbon group that's added to certain parts of the DNA, which stops transcription of that gene. So essentially what we're measuring is how many of those genes have essentially been regulated to be turned off. And as we age, we increase our levels of methylation in the genome. So we become more hypermethylated. However, there are certain locations that are highly correlated to sort of our risk of development of disease and death. And so that's really what we're looking at is how does the methylation on individual locations in your DNA correlate to the development of these diseases. And by looking at this data, we can tell a lot of things. As you can see in my virtual background that, we can do even more than just epigenetic age. If there's one big takeaway, I think, from anyone listening here, it's that epigenetic methylation as a biomarker will overtake medicine in the next 20 years. It will become incredibly prevalent in every area of medicine. Right now, though, the majority of the research has been popularized and done in aging. And now with several other philosophy changes, there's a lot of people who are now imagining aging as a primary disease and one that can be treated and changed. And so that's sort of what we're hoping to facilitate, even though these markers can be informative of everything from whether or not you have ADHD, whether or not you might have cancer, or even when you might die. And so it can be trained to predict just about anything, but right now death is definitely the major application.
So the goal here, like if somebody's doing the test, and by the way, I did the test, I got back the results, which was amazing. I thought the data was really good. But like the goal is to decrease methylation, correct? It's like to figure out a strategy so our DNA doesn't hit those triggers that cause disease.
That's exactly right. We want to control that aging, and it's not always that we want to decrease methylation. It might, and it depends on the area. For some areas, we might want to increase, some areas we might want to decrease. But the idea is that we want to find interventions which can help us just change those markers to a more ideal state.
Okay, so when I went through the test, the first thing that I recall is I had two numbers for age. I had something known as the intrinsic age, and then I had my extrinsic age. My chronological age is 52. My extrinsic epigenetic age is, my intrinsic epigenetic age is 48, and my extrinsic age is 43. So there's a lot of numbers there. What number should I be paying more attention to?
So unfortunately, that's I would say something we would decide on a case-by-case basis. Unfortunately, because each of those algorithms are different and they tell us a little bit of different things. In particular, that intrinsic age rate that we talked about, that is sort of the baseline fundamental process of aging. And so that is really capturing a pure vision of your aging history. However, that extrinsic age is really not incorporating immune cell subsets, which is really where we're getting our data. We do a blood-based test. And so in blood, the majority of cells which we're testing are immune cells. And as a result, we can get some information even about those. And so that's sort of, I would say, put very, very simply, a measurement of your immune age or how well your immune system is aging, which is also very, very important, obviously, as we're exiting a pandemic. But the idea there, I think, would be if you're wanting just that baseline aging signal, it would be better to look at intrinsic age. However, for you, I think that, if we're focusing on both of those are obviously great scores, but we might put a higher emphasis on treating the one that is not as good, which would be that intrinsic age measurement.
Okay, and then in the report itself, you talk about things we can do to decrease the aging process. And you provided me with another report that shows I age at a rate of 0.91. So for every decade I live, I really age 9 years as opposed to 10 years. Is that because of lifestyle, or is that because my DNA is like that and old age runs in my family?
Yeah, so the thing I think to note is that your epigenetic DNA, the things that we're measuring, are a reflection of everything that you do in your entire life. It's a reflection of your diet, your lifestyle, how much sleep you get, how much even social interaction or exposure to green space or out at nature. All of these things are sort of logged in your epigenetic methylation profiles. Even talking about the green space in nature, we know that children who spend more time in nature tend to have higher IQs, and that might be mitigated by these differential control of what is expressed in their DNA. And so the important thing I think to note is that your DNA and your epigenetics is a reflection of all of these different factors, and controlling all of those different factors to the best of our ability to reduce aging would then improve all of our healthcare outcomes. And so that instantaneous rate of aging is one that is probably one of the most exciting algorithms. And so what that algorithm was done is trained off of over 1,000 children starting at age 3 in 1975 and following them until now they're over 45. And through all that time, every year they've taken all of these age-related biomarkers. They've taken everything from telomere length to lung functioning measurements to cholesterol measurements, et cetera, to create this rate of aging score, which tells you at that moment how fast are you aging. And so for you at aging at a 0.91, that is great. You would want to be aging less than a 1 year per year basis, because that means that you're aging slower biologically than you would be chronologically. And so just to give you an idea, even if you were slightly above 1 on that metric, you'd increase your risk of death over the next 7 years by 56%, and increase your risk of a chronic disease diagnosis by 54%. So on metrics like that, what we're really trying to look at is essentially how fast you're aging and how do we get that aging rate lower. And that one is particularly well suited for these investigations because it's incredibly precise. And so what we can even do is do a lot of personalized medicine where you and I, might implement the same medication, but my rate of aging might go up and yours might go down. And we can find out that that particular product is working a lot better for you at reversing that phenotype of aging.
So like for these tests, you guys have been doing this now for, I think you said 2 years approximately?
Yeah, so a little bit, that's, I would say, approximately correct, about a year and a half. And this is a very, very new science, just regardless.
So like in order for because when you run the DNA, you come up with markers, but in order to correlate it to actionable steps, the more data you have, the more accurate the testing is, because then you can make suggestions saying, okay, we know this because we've done thousands and thousands of tests.
That's absolutely right. The way that these interpretations are created, I always liken it to even things like cholesterol measurements. We now know that cholesterol is linked to several different things like heart disease. But whenever we first were taking blood and we identified cholesterol, what we really had to do was find out what those people with high cholesterol ended up happening to them, right? And what we saw is that those people with high cholesterol tended to have worse cardiovascular related outcomes. But we had to figure out what that meant. And it's the same with these epigenetic methylation values. Is we're getting a lot of data here. There's 29 million different locations we can look at per cell, and every cell has a different expression. And so by looking at this data, we can train these artificial intelligence and computer learning programs to predict whatever output we might want. So for instance, in the case of these early algorithms, they were trained to predict chronologic age. They were meant to estimate with these markers as close to chronological age as possible. And so the idea is that the more data that you have to train against whatever outcome you'd like to predict, the better that these algorithms will get. The more specific, the more precise, and we're seeing great increases on these algorithms on even a weekly basis as they continue to improve and obviously get more predictive of health outcomes and age, but also then predicting other types of disease as well.
So if the Holy Grail is like we want to live as healthy as possible, as long as possible, based on the data you have and what you've seen, what outliers for people who are younger epigenetically than biologically, what have you noticed that they have in common that we should all be doing?
Yeah, so a lot of what we do know is actually epidemiological. So it's from these large scale data cohorts where we look and we ask that exact same question. What are the best performers doing, or what do they have in common? And what are the worst agers have in common? And the majority of things that we found out there is that are relatively intuitive. The things that we already know help health are the things that also help, aging. And so it's difficult to figure out a cause and effect, but things, for instance, like metabolic disease or high levels of inflammation, poor sleep, high stress, all of these things are things that we definitively see have a very large negative impact on these measurements. However, there's still a large hereditary component as well. Up to 40% of the performance of some of these clocks are based on factors you can't control, or hereditary based factors. And so genetics and even your inheritance does play a huge proportion, but 60% is still within your control. And that can be mitigated by how you exercise, how you sleep. And generally what we know there is that most things in moderation tend to be good. For instance, in a lot of our athletes, particularly Olympic or professional athletes, we see that they surprisingly have increased epigenetic ages. And that might be because they're exercising too much, putting their body under too much stress. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, we see that too little is also not a good thing. And so I would say moderation is one of the things that we're seeing across the board. And then from an epidemiological perspective, doing the things just intuitively that you can imagine for better health. We do know a few things as well about what to eat and what not to eat. We know a few things about what to drink and what not to drink. We know, for instance, that alcohol, particularly beer or wine at 2 or more drinks per week is actually better for epigenetic aging. Whereas we know that if you do 10 drinks or more, then on average, you would have a 2.22 year age acceleration than those who do not. And so again, just to sort of speak to this idea that a lot of the behaviors that we know of are relatively intuitive from what we found out in other areas of science. But we're also finding out a lot of really unique therapies, which might be able to reverse the clock as well.
So like you hear about like the holy grail of health is let's figure out how to completely stop aging.
Mhm.
You hear that from some like really visionary forward thinkers who think that aging is just something that once we treat aging, we will just stay healthy until some traumatic event kills us. Um, like in stuff that you guys have been doing, have you found anything where you've tested somebody, you've had them do some stuff and seen aging reverse to zero, the rate of aging go to zero or even negative?
So we haven't, and at the moment, no one has. I should say, seen complete reduction. The exception is actually a process that happens in embryogenesis. So whenever we're creating these embryos, there's a point at which the epigenetic ages go from the age of the sperm and the egg of the parents to zero. Everything is reset. And so a lot of people are looking into that process to see how that actually happens, and so that they can replicate it. A lot of news has been made about this recently as Jeff Bezos and Yuri Milner have sort of created this company called Altos Labs, which is focused exactly on that premise, which is that they want to mimic the process in embryogenesis for a cellular reset, to reset all of our cells to age zero at any time. And that is there have been some other evidences and studies published which would lead us to believe that might be possible. One of those things has happened at Dr. David Sinclair's lab at Harvard, where they've used some Yamanaka factors, which are sort of these growth factors, to then essentially reset the epigenetic age of, for instance, diseased mice who have become blind due to age-related vision loss. And they were actually able to even restore vision in those mice based on the combination of factors, where they were able to reverse the age of those cells and then improve vision. And so there are some experiments out there which give a lot of hope to this idea of an aging reset, where we can sort of start from scratch. But we also have a long way to go. One of the big problems with those Yamanaka factors, as I mentioned, is that they can be also very oncogenic or proliferate to cancer. And so there might be some fear about that too. So I think that the idea is right now there's no way to reset this to zero, but there are ways to turn back the clock. And there are other interventions that we can talk about, which have been published, which are able to then reverse age, even age in multiple years. And as we talk about 7 years as that benchmark, right, that 7 years younger biologically than chronologically, we can get there. We can get to that 7-year mark. And so that's sort of what we try and tell all of our physicians and patients to really shoot for, is that 7-year delta to really reduce their risk and definitely improve their aging.
No, the world that both you and I come from is the world of using peptides, hormones, testosterone replacement therapy. Have you guys done any studies to see people that are supplementing with growth hormone or growth hormone peptides or testosterone, and what effects have that had on the aging process?
Yeah, so in some of these larger meta-analyses we're looking at now, we're actually probably seeing a signal for a slightly increased epigenetic age with the administration of growth hormone. And for a lot of people, that's probably not a surprise. One of the reasons is that higher growth hormone and IGF-1 levels have been correlated to increased mortality for a long, long time. However, there's mixed data, I would say, as well. In one particular trial, the first ever interventional trial published on reversing this metric, they used a combination of metformin, growth hormone, and DHEA. And that study, over the course of 1.5 years worth of time, was able to, on average, reverse the epigenetic age of their patients by 2.5 years. And so that was a really significant finding. There were some problems with the study in the fact that it was relatively underpowered with only 9 patients, but it was also the first ever proof of concept study to show we can actually reverse this measurement. Since then, a lot of other data has come out, and as this type of diagnostic becomes a little bit more common, we're starting to see trends in even larger data sets. And I would say the larger trends that we've seen, at least in our patient subsets, are that growth hormone might have a slight negative impact on that aging rate. But we also know that the growth hormone can have a major impact on a lot of the phenotypic variables we experience with aging, such as fat mass or metabolic dysfunction or even just energy or sleep quality. And so we're not at this point telling people to avoid it, but we are trying to gather more data.
So in terms of diet, diet, I've heard people should stay away from carbs. People should stay away from meats. Um, we should do intermittent fasting. Have you guys looked at how diet plays a role in the aging process? And based on the data you have so far, what diet would you recommend for people? Or is it basically based on your DNA? Could you tell somebody what's the right diet for them?
At the moment, we can't necessarily tell from these DNA methylation profiles what is the best diet for an individual. We will absolutely get there, I think, once the science is a little bit more definitive. But what we know about the best diets for aging are relatively clear, and actually really well studied. In terms of types of diets, I think that one that has been published now several times in 3 different papers to have an effect on reducing epigenetic age is the Mediterranean diet. The Mediterranean diet and variations thereof have shown to reduce this epigenetic aging rate, particularly in those who already have advanced aging. So a lot of the times, if you take our test and you have advanced aging, you're older biologically than you are chronologically, we might suggest things like that Mediterranean diet. We also know that, for instance, consumption of legumes has a very positive effect in these large-scale studies as well. But I think that the one thing that we've sort of definitively found is that there's probably no better diet or no better type of incorporation than caloric restriction or fasting. I think that in several different trials, they've demonstrated some of the longevity benefits of caloric restriction. However, in the calorie trial, which is a 2-year study on 25% caloric restriction. So basically, the individuals who have for 2 years eaten at 25% reduced diet from their metabolic rate plus activity. And in those patients, we can see drastic changes in the rates of aging in over the course of those 2 years, with some people in the control group aging 2 years or more, and people in the caloric restriction group, maxing out at around half a year of aging. And so, with that being said, caloric restriction is one of those things that again and again we see to be very, very positive. And we can also say that that trend holds out to even a lot of fasting protocols. Particularly, it holds out to things like Prolon or the fasting mimicking diets. And it also holds out to, water fasts of 24 hours or 48 hours if they're done relatively frequently. So caloric restriction and increasing autophagy as a result of caloric restriction do show much improved age profiles in anyone we've tested.
Now, have you ever looked at like people who live in blue zones do you look at people in their 90s and try to make inferences based on the way they've lived at their life to come up with some conclusions?
So the answer is we have unfortunately not done that work, but that work has been looked at and is continuing to expand. We are starting to pick up certain signatures which might be correlated to better or worse aging rates, which will then improve these clocks so that we can actually make more specific recommendations and on a personalized level. At the moment, as I mentioned, we do know that a lot of genetics does play a relatively big role. We know that, as I mentioned, 40% of some of these clocks are made up of hereditary factors. And we know that, for instance, those people who have centenarians in their family or people who've lived over 100 are significantly more likely to have better epigenetic aging rates. And so we're starting to learn a little bit about what genes might be impacting this epigenetic regulation as well, and are trying to incorporate those into better diagnostics to really have a full picture of everyone's aging process.
Now, a while ago, people were talking about telomeres as being a very good indication of how long we're going to live. I know that you did do a telomere test, but do you find that the telomere testing correlates well with your epigenetic age?
Yeah, so there was an interesting experiment that was done to sort of ask this question: is how are epigenetic regulation and telomere length sort of together? And what they did is they essentially made in a certain cell subset, they immortalized these telomere cells. So they made sure that these telomeres never got shorter, and then they looked to see at how the biological age was changed, even though the telomeres could not shorten. And what they found was that the cells actually still aged from an epigenetic perspective. And so what that shows us is that telomere length and this epigenetic aging are two separate and distinct processes. And so that's important to know. The second thing to sort of ask is, which is more predictive of disease and health consequences, and which is more highly correlated to aging? And so if you compare the correlation levels between telomere length and aging, your R values for that are right around 0.3, whereas the correlation between these epigenetic clocks and aging are in the 0.9s. They're significantly better, over 3 times as highly correlated to age. Even our epigenetic measurement is got double the correlation value of telomeres to age than regular telomere length testing does. And it's also more predictive of healthcare outcomes. And that's been one of the biggest, I would say, knocks on telomere length testing for a long time, is that if you have short telomeres, what does that mean? Does it mean that you're, going to develop a certain type of disease? It's not the most predictive. Although extensively validated, it has very low predictive power. And so these epigenetic age measurements are a little bit different in that, in the fact that their hazard ratios and their predictive ability for disease is significantly higher. And so as a result, they're probably a better method of aging, although they're capturing two very distinct different processes. There was a study published recently which talked about the phenotypic variation from individual to individual. And it really attributed right around 2% of that individual aging difference to telomeres, whereas over 35% of that aging difference was due to these biological age clocks. And so I think head to head, these biological age clocks are better measurements to get a picture of your aging, but they're capturing two different processes. And telomere length is probably still a very important process.
Would you see people dying before they get into super old age? A lot of times it's heart disease or cancer.
Absolutely.
Now, and I know that cancer is related to the way our DNA switches on and off. I assume that might be methylation, but is there a way to tell somebody by looking at these tests, you are more at risk for getting cancer or a certain type of cancer?
Definitely, absolutely. And for instance, for every 1 year that you're older biologically than chronologically, so if someone was 50 and they had a biological age of 52, for every 1 year increase, you would increase your risk of developing cancer in the next 3 years by 6%. So someone 2 years older would have a 12% increased risk of developing cancer. For every 1 year you're older biologically and chronologically, you'd have a 17% increased risk of dying of cancer in the next 5 years. And so that person would have a 34% increased risk of dying of cancer in the next 5 years. So this epigenetic age measurement is absolutely tied to the risk of developing cancer. And you can actually say those same things about risk as it relates to cardiovascular disease, which is why aging is so important, is because it connects to every other chronic disease and death. And if you're really trying to affect all of those risk factors at once, the one thing you should do is reverse that aging process. However, I should also mention, though, that there are also really exciting methylation-based tests out there on the market currently, which are able to even do what they call stage 0 liquid biopsies. So by just taking some plasma from your blood, they can actually detect over 20 types of cancer before it's found in any other type of testing method, or MRIs, for instance. And so what this allows us to do is to detect cancer very, very, very early. The pioneers of that testing are a company called Grail, which offers a test called Galeri. And that testing is available right now to any provider that would want to prescribe it. And it detects, over 20 different types of cancers at stage 0, which gives you an idea about how precise and accurate this type of methylation testing can be to health outcomes. And exactly what I mean when I say it will affect every area of medicine.
What are your goals? I think the technology is exciting.
Mm-hmm.
So far, you don't have like this mass adoption yet, and I would assume some of it's because we just don't have enough data
Absolutely.
yet and enough actionable steps. But are your goals to see this just become mainstream in general healthcare?
Definitely. And there's no doubt in my mind that with our company or without it, epigenetic methylation testing will be very predominant in healthcare over the next even 5 to 10 years. You'll do this testing, I think, fairly frequently in the future. And so it's a really exciting platform. And that is exactly our goal, is to be the ones who can help interpret that data in some of the best ways possible. Right now, we have the largest private epigenetic database in the world. Since our inception, we've tested over 16,000 individual patients and gathered a lot of the other data, which really will help us understand how to interpret those epigenetic marks. Right now, there's algorithms in the way, I should say, in development for just about everything you can imagine. Being able to obviously detect cancer, as I mentioned, being able to predict athletic performance or even IQ or brain aging or Alzheimer's. All of these things are currently in development. And the idea is that very, very soon you will be able to maybe take one test that will be able to report out a lot of different metrics, everything from the proteins in your blood to the hormone levels in your blood, all through epigenetic methylation.
I think it's exciting. At the same time, I think it's a little scary to know, like, with one blood test, like, I wouldn't want to know when I would die. Like, there's a little scariness to it, and it's like we have to trust the algorithm. So I think getting that algorithm right is going to be crucial to that. But I think also, like, actionable steps in healthcare. Healthcare is very slow to adopt this. Like, what do you think is going to move the needle and get more doctors and more patients on board with epigenetic testing?
Yeah, so I think, unfortunately with these algorithms, each algorithm is different, and so you have to approach each algorithm a little bit separately, because some algorithms might be incredibly accurate, other algorithms might be less accurate, or might have some margin of error, for instance. And so you really have to have it on an algorithm-based conversation. The one thing I should say about the sort of future of epigenetics and even death predictors is that some of these things are already being used commercially in other businesses outside of healthcare. They're used for forensics to date how old people might be at crime scenes, or they're used for refugees to see if they're adults or minors and therefore eligible for asylum. So it's already been applicable. In the case of the death predictor, there are actually companies out there currently which will offer you health insurance based on your performance on that test. So they can essentially increase your premiums if you're more likely to be sick, or increase your life insurance premiums if you're more likely to die very quickly. And so those are already in effect. And I think that in order to have adoption across the healthcare field, what we absolutely need is more data and sort of a standardized way to have these discussions with the FDA to say that these algorithms are predictive at this point, and at this point it becomes applicable for the large majority of the population. And in order to do that, we need a lot more data sets and a lot more people testing epigenetics in the first place. And that's one of the things that we think we can do is a lot of people are interested in their aging rate. There are a lot of people are interested in changing their aging rate. And if we can get some of their other health data with that, then we can create algorithms and predictive capabilities in every type of disease to really push this forward in its clinical application.
Where is the FDA in terms of looking at this? Are they excited about this? Or are they a little skeptical?
Yes, I think a little of both. I think they're excited, but also skeptical. One of the big issues with this is actually the methylation technology. The actual way to do this testing has not had an FDA approved pathway yet, and so this is still a very, very new technique, even to designate it, let alone the interpretation of that data which comes from this technique. And so it absolutely will have to go through the de novo pathway. And I think that Grail, that company that does the liquid biopsy cancer testing, is one of the people at the forefront of putting this into the FDA's hands and setting those guidelines. Right now, aging itself is also not categorized as a disease by the FDA. And so as a result, this type of testing is actually not considered health testing as much as it is lifestyle testing, which is, an unfortunate designation, but I think we're starting to see movement from the FDA and other regulatory bodies like the World Health Organization, for instance, who have now added aging as an ICD-11 extension code, so that we can sort of explain certain diseases because they were caused by age. And so we're starting to see that age is now being more considered as a disease, but a lot of these regulatory bodies have been a little bit slow to accept it in the same way.
That's exciting. It's interesting how you got, how you transitioned into it. But what was it like that got you to say, you know what, I'm going to go all in on this. I'm going to build this company up. I'm going to bring this to the masses.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, that the TRIM trial, the one that looked at metformin, growth hormone, and DHEA, that was the first ever proof of concept study, and to show you could reverse epigenetic age. And whenever I saw that, I very quickly set up a flight out to talk to the study authors and to learn a little bit more about this. And I also took sort of an idea of who was doing this in the space. And unfortunately, at that time, there were really no one doing it commercially or making these things available for physicians and their patients. And if they were only looking at right around 1,000 different locations in the genome, which is incredibly, incredibly small, and really not pushing the field forward. They were sort of just doing it as a test and not as a platform to improve medicine and improve diagnostics. And so I saw a lot of opportunity there, but I also saw a market. I know, Mark, the same people you talk to and deal with daily are all focused on aging as a primary outcome. And I think a lot of the people that we had made connections with in some of our previous businesses were all very interested in quantifying this process. Even groups like the age management medical community and have been around for decades, and now we actually have a way to test and objectively show how a lot of the interventions which they recommend are affecting the aging process in a way that is applicable to every area of medicine. And so I saw an opportunity there to sort of bridge two worlds, the more traditional community, as well as sort of this cash pay integrative or functional medicine community, all with an objective biomarker, which will sort of prove that a lot of the interventions that this cash pay medicine space are doing are actually very, very helpful in improving patients' lives.
Is the goal also to have people go to doctors to get this testing done, or do you offer this test direct to consumers and then they make their own interpretation?
So we do offer this testing direct to consumer, but it represents less than 1% of all of our entire business. We do recommend. One is because, as I mentioned, each of these algorithms has a separate educational learning curve. And so in order to make best use of the data, it's very helpful to have the experience and guidance of a medical practitioner. Secondarily to that, we can't offer many of our reports direct to consumer. Anything that would report on disease, we cannot offer direct to consumer. And so a lot of these providers are able to offer more value to anyone who does this testing. In the future, we imagine that there will be pieces that will be able to do both through providers as well as direct to consumer. But right now, we're definitely encouraging most people to work with a physician or some other clinical provider in order to review this information.
And then as the data comes in, like I had my test done probably about a month ago, but let's say you get more data, will that change the interpretation at all? Or do I just get another test with the new data?
No, so we'll absolutely update in perpetuity with any new reports that we add. And we have several that we're planning on adding even just in the next few weeks. And so we will continue to interpret that data with any new mechanism that comes around, any new algorithm which is developed. So, even over the course of the next few weeks, you'll probably get updated immune cell subsets where we're actually, in that extrinsic age report, we're looking at your immune system health. We can actually break down, how many basophils or neutrophils or CD4 or CD8 T cells you have. Over the next few weeks, we'll probably improve that to 8 or 9 different immune cell subsets in order to give you a better view of your immune system. And we'll continue to update those as new algorithms and interpretations come out. But I should mention, it's only for the time you took the test, right? It's not, it's a point in time investigation. And although we can continue to interpret that point in time, we do recommend people redo this testing to get an idea of what interventions are working for them. We always say you can't manage what you can't measure. And now you can measure it, you're able to more effectively manage it. And that is exactly what we're encouraging people to do, is to test maybe once every year to get an idea of how they're aging, and then make changes, and then try and retest and compete with yourself to get that metric as low as possible.
That's very exciting. So if they want to get more information, they just go to TruDiagnostic.com.
Yeah, absolutely. TruDiagnostic.com. You can also contact me at Ryan@TruDiagnostic.com if you have any questions. We love spreading the word about this. It's a very, very exciting technology with what will be a lot of application. And so if anyone has any questions as a provider, feel free to reach out to us. Or even if you're a patient, we're happy to connect you with a provider who might be able to help.
Great. That's exciting. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Mark. Appreciate it.